characters, following teams, following brands, as it were. At what point did you start recognizing the names of pros and following writers, or at least you were conscious of the fact that, say, a Bill Mantlo was somebody who wrote comics that you liked, and you started seeking out the creative names that were behind the comics that you loved?
For me, that would have been, that was a 2000 AD thing, because 2000 AD was one of the very first British comics, I think, anywhere to have credits. And before that, you know, credits in comics were kind of unheard of. And to the extent that I'm not sure some artists were even sort of allowed to sign their pages at DC Thompson. So it was really easy to kind of like, if you saw some art that you really liked, you could like work out who it was very, very quickly. So I very quickly kind of, and you know, people, John Wagner, who created Judge Dredd and is still today the main Dredd writer. He had a number of pseudonyms to kind of make it a little, so he could do like loads of work and, you know, and it wouldn't look like he was just writing the entire comic. But aside from that, it was really easy to sort of, you know, if especially with artists, if Carlos Escarra, you know, did like Strontium Dog, you know, you could sort of, it was really easy to sort of learn his name and kind of see when he was doing dreads, and so yeah, I was kind of taught that from a very early age to sort of look out for like who was working on what. And yeah, the idea of, so obviously I kind of carried that with me to like to the American comics, and I think John Byrne was the first, because I was a big fan of Alpha Flight, which ran as a backup in the UK Secret Wars reprint. And John Byrne just like really, I started picking up anything with John Byrne's name in it, so he would have probably been the first in terms of, the first that I had to go and seek out rather than was sort of handed to me in a package every week kind of thing.
So there was a book called Plop that I loved. It was a humor horror anthology, and I was very little when this was coming out. But I remember reading a Bernie Wrightson story in one of those issues, and Bernie Wrightson is probably the first creator that I started immediately noticing, and he drew fingers a certain way. In a lot of Bernie Wrightson comics, something would fall on somebody's head, they'd spasm, and their fingers would be all twisted up. And that was his signature, and that's how I knew it was Bernie Wrightson, is that there would be fingers all twisted when someone was getting killed. But then, Bill Mantlo, when I started reading Micronauts, I immediately gravitated to who that writer was, and I took note even as, you know, I don't know, 8, 7, I don't know, but I started paying attention to who that writer was, and then Chris Claremont with the X-Men run, and Jim Starlin were probably the ones that I first started really, those are the names that I really started saying, oh, I'm gonna read whatever they do.
So in the 70s, you know, Stan Lee was already such a cult personality that I have a lot of clear memories of knowing who he was, although I wasn't really reading his writing at that point, right? But I knew that there were people who made the comics. Excuse me. From an early age, though, I remember looking at the comics and always looking at the credits and misremembering how names were spelled and mispronouncing them and stuff as a kid. One very clear memory I have of noticing a creator's name was I had an issue of Amazing Spider-Man somewhere in the late 100s that had Man-Wolf in it, and it was written by Marv Wolfman, and I'm like, come on, like that's a made-up name. That, you know, that's like a little in-joke or something. And I do remember around that time, you know, John Byrne was drawing, and John Byrne is probably the first person that I wouldn't necessarily seek out, but I would immediately recognize their artwork and know I was in for something great. Walt Simonson was another early one that was somebody I would gravitate toward and look for what they were doing. And even at the same time as Walt Simonson, the first letterer whose name I ever went out of my way to look up was John Workman, because he had such a unique style, and his sound effects especially were just incredible in Thor and Fantastic Four with Walt. And so yeah, I had a concept of it pretty early on, which is why I wrote my first pitch to Marvel when I was in high school.
Who are some of the creatives that you came up as a fan of, who you've encountered, maybe even worked with as professionals? Have you had any of those almost fanboy moments with people whose work you admired, meeting them at conventions, meeting them in a professional setting, or just, having that first interaction actually being, oh, I'm working with this person whose work I came up admiring, or find yourself in a summit meeting with, something like that?
Yep. So I was invited to a convention in Northern Ohio. I was living in Columbus at the time, and it was an anime convention. And I had a book called Sentinel at the time, which was drawn by Udon Studios, and they have a very manga sensibility in their artwork. But the only other comic book guest was Walt Simonson. And so they sat us next to each other, and I met Walt, and he's such a terrific, generous individual, and we talked all day, and then as the show was winding down, he's like, hey, what are you doing for dinner? And we went across the street to Bob Evans, and I sat there with Walt Simonson for an hour and a half, and he's telling me stories of Marvel in the 80s, and it was just the most amazing thing ever. And at some point, he's like, well, you're a young guy, you probably want to go back over to the bar and get drunk and stuff. I'm like, are you kidding me? I want to sit here all night and let's get more coffee, and I want to talk with you. I don't have any of those be careful meeting your heroes kind of stories. There are so many great creators in comics. I got to work with Marv Wolfman eventually, and I didn't call him Wolfman. And he was a terrific and great collaborator. And it's a ton of pinch me moments like that for me, and it's great. It's a real privilege.
Yeah, I actually met Marv Wolfman at a convention in London at one point, because we both happened to be there, and it was like, I've never really been one of those people who I'm kind of slightly intimidated on the inside, but I've never been one of those people who just gushes so much they can't have a conversation kind of thing. So we ended up just talking about video games for about an hour, and
What kind of video games does Marv Wolfman play?
I think we both ended up talking about the newest Batman game at the time, which was the one where you have to drive the car. Choose my words carefully there, you have to drive the car. You're forced to drive his bloody car. I hate that car, it's awful. The Batmobile is the worst. So yeah, we just moaned about that for ages. But I think he was working on a computer game at the time, I forget precisely what it was, but he was working on one at the time, so that was the inroad to that conversation.
Was it Altered Beast, where you turn into a werewolf?
Yes. But in terms of the big fanboy moments, working with Mark Waid on the Avengers crossover it got slightly surreal.
That combination of you and Mark and Jim Zub produced one of my favorite crossover events, not just in recent memory, but it's just, it is good meat and potato superhero stuff.
Thank you very much. I think Jim was the secret sauce there. He was the guy who kept us on track. His energy, the energy he always brings to every project, that kind of filled up. He had all of his own energy and enough extra energy for two other people. So he kept all of our tanks full. But just talk to Mark at the outset of that, and I'd been in the room with him, but slightly deferential. I just got to do it, and it was I kind of told him how much I loved Doom Patrol, which was when he was an editor. So and obviously I was a big fan of his work, and he knew that, but it was talking about Doom Patrol, how much I loved that as a kid, and there was this slightly pained look in his face as he did the maths. Worked out, you know, how old I was, and it's like, okay, now we're working together, great. It's like, you know, so, yeah, that was a good moment for me, maybe not for him.
I have a really possibly dumb follow-up, specifically about that Avengers piece. Jim has told me that you are the one to be thanked for involving Living Lightning, one of my secret favorite Avengers of all time, underappreciated.
I pushed hard for Living Lightning because I love shoulder pads. No, I pushed hard for Living Lightning because it was like, I just, every so often I'll go back into the archives and I'll kind of get fascinated by a character and I'll want to see them again. And you know, I'm in a position where I can sort of try and push that and bring people back, and sometimes it leads to like stuff getting cancelled after 12 issues or 10 issues or something. But like, you know, sometimes it doesn't, and that time it worked. The bit where I disagree strongly, I know Jim has publicly defamed Living Lightning's amazing costume and shoulder pads. I'll answer him here and now. Those shoulder pads are amazing, and I'll hear not a word about changing Lightning's costume.
Well,
change his name if you must, but not that costume. That costume stay.
Well, this dirt's gonna be on Bleeding Cool in like 12 seconds.
The feud.
Yeah.
The feud that would
The feud that wouldn't die over Living Lightning. Rich Johnson's gonna break it right open. He's got spies here. Cullen, any interactions with heroes of yours, either working with them or just interacting with them on the concert?
Yeah, I mean, there's just tons over since I started going to conventions and starting actually working in comics, there's tons of examples, and like Sean, I don't have any bad don't meet your hero moments, even the ones that people said, oh, that person's a crotchety old creator. Everyone, and they end up being delightful. I don't have any real negative interactions. And now it's interesting. I have a lot of these people that I consider friends, and my favorite writer, not comic, well, he does write comics, but he's mainly a prose writer, Joe Lansdale. I consider him a friend. I'm pen pals with Michael Moorcock, who is, was to me one of the most influential writers ever. And so to me that's surreal that that we interact. Maybe the weirdest one is, or for me it was surreal. I can vividly remember when I read the comic Long Shot, the first issue of Long Shot by Art Adams, when I was very young. But and a couple of years ago, when I was working on X-Men Blue, my phone rings one morning, and I pick up the phone, and they say, can I speak to Cullen? I was like, yeah. Well, this is Art Adams. I said, who is this? I was like, it's Art Adams. I was like, why are you calling me? But just, so I got real, I think I did get a little fanboyish there, talking to Art Adams. He was doing the covers for X-Men Blue, and he wanted to talk about what we might do on those covers. And then we talked about Godzilla for like an hour.
That's hard.
So not even necessarily deep cut, but characters that you were a fan of coming up that you've gotten to work on